That night in a small room, Jimi Hendrix sat quietly and listened. The critic insulted him. And then Jimi said something that left the man unable to recognize himself. The room was barely 15 feet across. A rehearsal space in London, 1967. Wooden floor. White walls. One amplifier in the corner. 3 folding chairs. And 7 people who would carry this moment for the rest of their lives. Jimi Hendrix sat on the floor, legs crossed, his Stratocaster resting across his lap. He wasn't playing. Just holding it. His fingers occasionally moved along the neck, not fretting notes, just touching the wood like you'd touch something familiar when you needed to stay grounded. Across from him, standing, was a man named Richard Ashford, music critic for one of London's major newspapers. 43 years old. Oxford educated. 20 years of writing about music. He wore a blazer even in this cramped space. His hair was slicked back. His posture was rigid with the kind of authority that comes from never being meaningfully challenged. The other 5 people in the room, session musicians who'd been jamming with Jimi, a sound engineer, a photographer who'd been documenting rehearsals, sat or stood against the walls, watching, sensing something was about to happen. Ashford had been invited by the studio manager. "Come hear Hendrix rehearse," he'd said. "You'll want to write about this." What he'd meant was, "Come see genius." What Ashford had heard was, "Come judge an American trying to impress London." For 20 minutes, Jimi had played. Not performed, played. The kind of playing that happens when no one's watching, when you're exploring sound rather than delivering it. He'd been working through a new piece, finding the spaces between notes, letting the guitar speak in whispers instead of screams. Ashford had watched with his arms crossed, his face arranged in an expression of professional skepticism. When Jimi paused to retune, Ashford spoke. "You know what your problem is, Hendrix?" The room went quiet. The kind of quiet where everyone stops breathing at the same time. Jimi looked up slowly. He didn't speak. Just waited. "Your problem," Ashford continued, walking closer, "is that you mistake volume for substance. You mistake novelty for artistry. You play the guitar like someone who learned from records instead of studying properly. You're all flash and showmanship. Parlor tricks. Nothing underneath." One of the session musicians, a bassist named Colin, shifted uncomfortably against the wall. The photographer lowered his camera. Everyone in that room knew what was happening. A man with credentials was trying to put a genius in his place. "I've reviewed hundreds of guitarists," Ashford said, his voice carrying that particular British condescension that sounds like education. "Clapton, Beck, Page. They have technique. They have training. They have discipline. You have gimmicks." He paused, waiting for a reaction. Waiting for Jimi to defend himself, to argue, to prove his worth. Jimi Hendrix sat completely still. His hands rested on his guitar. His face showed no anger, no hurt, no need to prove anything. He just looked at Ashford with dark, steady eyes that seemed to be seeing something beyond the words. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "You want me to play properly?" Jimi asked quietly. His accent, that soft American inflection, made the question sound genuinely curious rather than defensive. "Like Clapton? Like Beck?" "If you can," Ashford said, unable to resist the challenge. "Show us you can actually play beyond your circus act." Jimi nodded slowly. He adjusted his position slightly, settling the guitar more comfortably. His fingers found the strings. And then he played. What came out of that Stratocaster was not Jimi Hendrix's sound. It was Eric Clapton's sound. Note for note, tone for tone, technique perfect. He played 30 seconds of pure Clapton, the phrasing, the vibrato, the controlled passion that had made Clapton a god to British audiences. Then he stopped. "That's Eric," he said simply. And then he played Jeff Beck. The aggressive attack, the innovative bends, the controlled feedback. Perfect mimicry. "That's Jeff." Then Jimmy Page. The heavy, bluesy power. The dramatic dynamics. That's Jimi. He stopped again. The room was frozen. Ashford's face had gone pale. I can play like them, Jimi said, his voice still quiet, still calm. I learned by listening. Same as them. Same as everyone. There's no properly. There's just what you hear and what you do with it. He let that sit in the air for a moment. Then he played again. This time it was purely Jimi. That sound that couldn't be mistaken for anyone else. Not aggressive. Not showing off. Just him. Notes that bent in ways that shouldn't work but did. Silence used like punctuation. The guitar becoming an extension of thought rather than an instrument being played. He played for maybe 45 seconds. Then stopped. His hands rested back on the guitar body. I don't play like them, Jimi said, looking directly at Ashford, because I'm not trying to be them. I'm trying to be honest about what I hear. That's all. That's the only discipline that matters. The room held its breath. Ashford opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Nothing came out. For perhaps the first time in 20 years of criticizing musicians, Richard Ashford had no response. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Richard Ashford was. He'd built his entire career on being the arbiter. The one who decided what was worthy. He'd written devastating reviews that ended tours. He'd praised musicians who later became legends and could credit him with early recognition. He'd positioned himself as the gatekeeper between noise and art. His authority came from his education, his years of study, his understanding of music theory and classical training. When he wrote that someone was merely technical, or lacking substance, it carried weight because he could explain why in ways that sounded inarguable. He'd been prepared for Hendrix to argue, to defend, to try to prove himself through more playing. That was what musicians did when challenged. They performed harder, played louder, tried to overwhelm skepticism with demonstration. But Jimi had done something Ashford couldn't process. He'd shown that he could play, properly, could match the technical precision of anyone Ashford respected, and then had chosen not to. Had chosen a different path. Not out of inability but out of intention. And in doing so, Jimi had revealed something Ashford had spent 20 years avoiding, that criticism based purely on technical standards missed the entire point of music. The silence stretched. Seconds became minutes. No one in that small room moved. Finally, Jimi spoke again. His voice was even quieter now, almost gentle. You know what I think your problem is? Ashford flinched. The role reversal was complete. Now he was the one being judged. He didn't answer. Couldn't. I think, Jimi said slowly, you're afraid. You've spent so long learning the rules that you're scared of what happens when someone shows you the rules are just a starting place. Not a prison. Just a starting place. He stood up, cradling his guitar, and walked to the amplifier. He turned it off. The hum died. The guitar doesn't care if you went to school, Jimi continued, his back to Ashford now, speaking to the amp as much as the man. It doesn't care if you can read music, or if you learn from records. It only cares if you're listening to what it's trying to tell you. If you're honest enough to follow where it leads instead of where you think it should go. He turned around. Looked at Ashford directly. That's what scares you. Not that I play badly. That I play freely. And it works. And you can't explain why using your rules. So you call it gimmicks. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. He walked across the small room to where Ashford stood, rigid and pale. Jimi held out his guitar. Here, he said simply. Play something. Ashford stared at the offered Stratocaster like it was a weapon. I'm a critic, not a performer. I know, Jimi said. That's the point. Play something. Anything. Show me what proper sounds like. The photographer would later say he'd never seen a man look so exposed. Colin, the bassist, would describe Ashford's face as the moment someone realizes they've been fighting a war that doesn't exist. Ashford didn't take the guitar. His hands stayed at his sides. "I can't," he whispered. "I know," Jimi said again, not cruelly, just factually. He lowered the guitar. "See, that's the thing about criticism. It's easy when you don't have to risk anything yourself. When you don't have to stand in front of people and say, this is what I hear, this is what I feel, judge me for it." He walked back to his spot on the floor and sat down, guitar back in his lap. "I'm not saying critics are bad," Jimi continued, his tone almost conversational now. "I'm saying criticism without humility is just fear dressed up as authority. You can tell me I'm not Clapton. That's true. I'm not. But you can't tell me I'm not honest. You weren't in the room when I learned these notes. You don't know what I'm trying to say with them." Ashford's mouth moved soundlessly. Then he turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold he stopped. Didn't turn around. Just stood there with his hand on the frame. "I've written about hundreds of musicians," he said, his voice hollow. "I thought I understood music. But I've never actually tried to." He didn't finish. Just left. The door closed softly behind him. The room exhaled collectively. Colin let out a low whistle. The sound engineer wiped his forehead. The photographer raised his camera again, but Jimi shook his head slightly. "No pictures of this." "Should we keep playing?" one of the other musicians asked. Jimi shook his head. "Nah. Let's just sit for a bit." So they did. 7 people in a small room, sitting in the aftermath of something none of them fully understood yet, but all of them knew mattered. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. Richard Ashford didn't write his planned review of Jimi Hendrix. In fact, he didn't write anything for 2 weeks. When he finally published again, it was different. Shorter sentences. Less certainty. More questions than declarations. His colleagues noticed. His editor asked if he was feeling well. 3 months later, Ashford wrote a piece titled, "On the Limits of Criticism." It never mentioned Jimi Hendrix by name, but everyone who read it carefully understood it was about that night in the rehearsal room. "We critics," he wrote, "often mistake our vocabulary for wisdom. We can describe what we hear, analyze its components, trace its influences. But description is not understanding. And analysis is not experience. The moment we forget that music is a conversation rather than a test, we become obstacles to the very thing we claim to serve." The piece was controversial. Some praised it. Others said Ashford was losing his edge. Within a year, he'd left the newspaper and started teaching music appreciation at a small college, where he was known for beginning every semester the same way, by admitting everything he didn't know. Jimi never spoke publicly about that night. When asked years later about dealing with critics, he just shrugged. "Everyone's trying to understand something. Some people use words. I use this." He gestured to his guitar. "Neither one's better. They're just different ways of being honest." But the people in that room never forgot. Colin, the bassist, would tell the story decades later to younger musicians. Jimi could have destroyed that guy. Could have humiliated him. Instead, he just held up a mirror and let the guy see himself. That's mastery. Not the playing, the humanity. The photographer's pictures from that session were never published. But he kept one print in his studio until he died, Jimi sitting cross-legged, guitar in lap, looking up with those steady eyes. No aggression. No pride. Just presence. On the back of the photograph, he'd written one sentence. "The day criticism met honesty, and couldn't speak." Years later, a young journalist found Richard Ashford teaching at that small college. Asked him about the rumor, the famous confrontation with Hendrix that supposedly changed his career. Ashford was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Jimi Hendrix taught me more in 5 minutes than I'd learned in 20 years. He showed me the difference between knowing about music and understanding it. I've spent every day since trying to listen the way he did." He paused. He didn't humiliate me. He freed me. That's what real mastery does. It doesn't crush you. It shows you who you could be. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The guitar Jimi offered that night, the one Ashford couldn't take, is in a museum now. Next to it, a small placard with a quote. The guitar doesn't care if you went to school. It only cares if you're listening. Jimi Hendrix never needed to raise his voice. He just needed one sentence. And silence did the rest.